We should make a decisive move now to preempt escalating infections.
After months of dithering, U-turns, chop and change measures that sparked so many infections and caused our people so many problems, Mr. Lee quite inexplicably uses words like preempt and decisive to describe his team's handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Welcome to the PAP world of spin. Hello everybody. This is precisely what I want to draw your attention to. It is this penchant for spin by the PAP that will get this country into deeper trouble. In the next few minutes, I'm going to demonstrate to you how PAP, by saying one thing while doing another, will make our lives even more difficult than it has been all these years. Let's take the issue of immigration and the influx of foreign workers. As early as 2003, the Economic Review Committee, of which Mr. Lee headed, said then that we must carefully manage the inflow of foreign workers to benefit our economy. But in 2012, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who was then DPM, suddenly made an about turn and warned that our increasing dependence on foreign workers is not sustainable. Here's the question. If the PAP had carefully managed the inflow of foreign workers, as Mr. Lee had promised in 2003, then why did Mr. Tharman have to sound the alarm saying that the policy is not sustainable? But Mr. Lee continued to assure us. In 2013, he said that the government would manage the complex issue of foreign workers and immigration carefully. In 2014, he repeated that the government would avoid over-dependence on foreign workers. We have also tightened up the number and quality of foreign workers, he said again in 2016. Then the coronavirus hit and laid bare how reliant and overexposed we were to foreign workers. Here's how dependent we've become. We had 30,000 workers from China who went home for the Lunar New Year this year and were caught by the virus spread from Wuhan. Manpower Minister Josephine Teo simply issued leave of absence notices to these returning workers, which for all intents and purposes were meaningless because under the rules they could still leave their homes briefly, whatever that means, to attend to matters. And many of these workers were renting rooms and living with their landlords and families. And get this, for employers who had difficulty finding accommodation for these workers to serve their LOA, the government referred them to, you wouldn't believe this, dorm operators. You can't make this stuff up. Now, these workers were then told that they should avoid crowded places and refrain from attending social or public gatherings. Why didn't we just stop them from coming back, at least until the crisis was over? Then there were the Malaysian workers. Now, literally overnight, thousands of them crossed the causeway so that they could beat the deadline and work in Singapore when Malaysia announced its lockdown on 18th March. There are 300,000 workers working in Singapore just from Malaysia alone. And remember, the reason why Malaysia closed its borders is that it saw an explosion of COVID infections there. The SDP warned at that time that tens of thousands of workers, many of whom may already be infected with the virus but show no symptoms, are crossing the causeway into Singapore undetected. The PAP ignored our warning and allowed the Malaysian workers in. It even promised assistance of $50 a worker a night for accommodation. Again, we should have just stopped these workers from coming in. But we couldn't, because without these workers, many of our factories cannot operate and our businesses cannot function. Even our bus system was affected, as many of the drivers are Malaysians who commute daily from JB. Some argue that many of these workers could have been in and out of Singapore even before the Malaysian lockdown. Maybe. But when we saw the spike in Malaysia, we should have immediately applied the brakes to and stopped the inflow. Then the inevitable happened. A 39-year-old Malaysian worker who had beaten the deadline and come into Singapore was later diagnosed with the virus. He was case 616. Contact tracing showed that he was either working at or had visited Mustafa Center and had spread the virus to other foreign workers and Singaporeans. He had started a cluster whose infections have come up to 114 at last count. Now, there is a good chance that he contributed massively to the current firestorm of an outbreak that has engulfed our foreign worker dormitories that we are witnessing today. Is this not the scariest indication of how over-dependent our economy has become on foreign workers? Now, this doesn't even take into account PRC nationals, which various estimates have it between 500,000 to 1 million of them living and working here. And what about workers from India? It's come to a point that every 4 out of 10 people here are not Singaporean. Now let that number sink in for a minute. How do we come to a stage where we are placed in this untenable position of having to choose between letting in foreigners and jeopardizing our health, or preventing them from coming in and risking an economic shutdown? That's how reliant we've become on foreigners. And yet, I repeat, as early as 2012, Mr. Tharman was already warning that our dependence on foreign workers had become unsustainable. It took 8 years before this COVID virus exposed this terrible position that the PAP put this country in. Which brings me to another important and related question. Now, primarily because of the continued influx of foreigners, our population has now increased to 5.7 million, up from 5.1 million since 2010. Now think about it. That's the number of about 5 GRCs stuffed into this island in a short span of 10 years. At this rate, we will have another 5 GRCs rammed down our throats by 2030. Can this island take it? Do these younger ministers know what they are doing? The way they've demonstrated their lack of foresight and planning ability in handling the Covid-19 and other crises should make us all deeply, deeply concerned. But here's the really frightening part. Not only is the PAP continuing to bring in foreigners, Mr. Heng Swee Keat has hinted at raising the population to 10 million. Listen to this report by the Straits Times in 2019. And I want to read it out word for word so that you don't think I'm making it up. Singapore's population density is not excessive, Mr. Heng said, noting that other cities are a lot more crowded in terms of livable space. He cited former Chief Planner Liu Tai Ke, who said in 2014 that Singapore should plan for 10 million people for it to remain sustainable in the long term. But you know what's even scarier? The PAP is already showing that it has difficulty containing the COVID virus with a population of 5.7 million. Imagine if we doubled the number to 10 million. Now, common sense tells us that a more crowded place increases the risk of a wider spread of diseases. Now, don't take my word for it. This is what Ms. Chan Heng Chee, our ambassador at large, said. Now, Singapore is the densest city and the densest country in the world, well, barring Monaco. We are denser than Hong Kong, and dense cities have a problem dealing with epidemics, with pandemics. And we want to increase our population to 10 million? Now, if you think I'm bringing this issue up in hindsight, you're dead wrong. In 2013, and that's 7 years ago, the SDP already alerted our people to this danger in our population policy. In it, we repeatedly warned, sudden rapid increases in population give rise to an increased risk of outbreaks of new diseases, and the likelihood that previously controlled infections will recur also rises. Researchers found in experiments with rats that as population density increased, social behavior degenerated. The rats grew withdrawn and passive, suffered from infectious diseases, became violent, even forming gangs, and even became less fertile. Infectious diseases spread more easily in a densely populated area and are harder to control. It is hugely important that you note this about our policy. I'll explain why in a minute. For now, we all know that there will be retrenchments and job losses to come. We need to stop this foolishness of bringing in ever more foreigners to compete with our citizens for jobs. Many of these jobs are given to foreigners because they accept lower wages, which Singaporeans cannot survive on. Jobs like admin staff, sales personnel, engineers, nurses, IT professionals, bankers, and even hairdressers and bus drivers are all jobs that Singaporeans can do but are given to foreigners simply because of cheaper wages. As a result, many of our PMETs have to resort to driving grab cars or delivering food. But here's where it really matters, my friends. Going forward, the PAP will continue to rely on spin, aided by its control of the newspapers and TV stations, to continue to get Singaporeans to believe that it is doing the right thing. Like how Mr. Lee kept assuring us that we would not become over-dependent on foreigners when the decay was taking place all the while. We cannot go on like this. Now, I mentioned earlier about our population policy, where we warned about an epidemic back in 2013. But it's not just the population policy. We have been drawing up a whole series of alternative policies for Singapore. Many of the circumstances that we've mentioned have come true. I cannot spell them all out for you in this short video, so please go to our website and read them, or at least read the summaries. I'll post links in the comment section below. We do this because we know that you want a competent and constructive first world opposition in Parliament, an opposition that does its homework, conducts research, and brings you that information so that we can become a truly intelligent and thinking people. And we've also launched our GE campaign message, 4 yes, 1 no. I'll talk about the 4 yeses on another occasion. For now, I'd like to focus on the no, which is no to Mr. Heng Swee Keat's, the next Prime Minister's, dangerous idea of a 10 million population. You have the opportunity at the next election to send the SDP into Parliament and give the PAP the clearest message yet, that we do not approve of more foreigners coming in to compete with us for jobs, not under these changed circumstances, and we do not approve of a 10 million population. We need a competent opposition to make the PAP deliver what it promises, not just rely on spin and nice sounding, but ultimately empty words like decisive or preempt or carefully manage immigration and avoid over-dependence on foreign workers. Because ultimately, trust is not what you say, it's what you do. And let me take this opportunity on behalf of my colleagues at the SDP to wish all our workers, both Singaporean and foreign, a most meaningful and resolute May Day. May we all stay united and healthy to fight for a brighter future. And let me pledge to you, my fellow Singaporeans, the SDP's undying loyalty. As they say in Hokkien, Pa Si Bui Zao.